Have you ever felt like the world has gone completely silent? Like every prayer you've whispered, every cry you've shouted has vanished into thin air? You're waiting, desperate for an answer, a sign, or just the faintest whisper that you're not alone in this. But all you hear is silence. That silence can feel like the loneliest place on earth, can it? It's where doubts creep in, where fear takes root, and where you begin to wonder if you've been forgotten. But what if I told you that the silence you're so afraid of isn't a void? What if it's not emptiness, but a divine classroom? What if the silence isn't punishment, but preparation? You see, I've walked through that silence. I've lived in that space where the questions outnumbered the answers and the nights felt longer than the days. I've stared at the ceiling, tears streaming down my face, asking, why me? Why now? Why this? And in those moments, the silence wasn't broken by a thunderous reply. There was no immediate clarity, no magical resolution. Instead, there was something more profound, an invitation to grow. Think about it for a moment. Growth never happens in the noise. Seeds don't sprout in the chaos of the wind. They grow beneath the soil, hidden in stillness. The most magnificent trees stand tall today because they were once silent roots digging deep, unseen by the world. Diamonds are forged not in the light, but in the darkness, under pressure, without an audience. And when you find yourself in the silence, my friend, you are being transformed in the same way. But I get it. Silence can feel unbearable. It can feel like rejection. It can make you question everything you're worth, your path, even your faith. But here's the truth. The silence is not the end. It's not a period at the end of your story. It's a comma. It's a pause for something greater. Because in the silence, God is still working. In the silence, He's shaping you. In the silence, He's teaching you lessons that you can't learn in the noise. Let me ask you this, when was the last time you really listened? Not just with your ears, but with your heart. The silence is where you learn to do that. It's where distractions fade, where the unnecessary noise of the world quiets down, and you're left with nothing but the truth. And the truth is this: you are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are not abandoned. The silence is not your enemy, it's your greatest teacher. I've come to understand something powerful about silence. It's where strength is born. It's where patience is tested. It's where faith is refined. Anyone can trust when life is easy, when the answers come quickly, when the blessings are obvious. But trusting in the silence, that's where real growth happens. That's where you discover who you truly are, and more importantly, who God truly is. Maybe right now you feel like you're buried, like the weight of the world is pressing down on you and you can't see the way out. But remember, the seeds aren't buried to be forgotten. They're buried to grow. You're not in the ground, you're in the soil. You're not abandoned, you're being cultivated. You're not finished, you're just beginning. Let's talk about trust for a moment. Trust isn't about understanding the plan. It's about believing in the planner. It's about knowing that even when you can't see the way forward, there's someone guiding your steps. The silence is where you learn to lean on that trust. It's where you stop trying to control everything and start surrendering to the process. And let me tell you, when you do that, when you let go of the need for immediate answers and lean into the silence, that's when transformation begins. I've seen it in my own life. I've been in situations where I felt completely lost, where the silence was so loud it was almost deafening. But looking back now, I realize those were the moments that shaped me the most. Those were the seasons where I learned resilience, where I discovered a strength I didn't know I had, and where my faith grew deeper than I ever thought possible. You see, the silence is not a sign of God's absence. It's a sign of His work. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles happen in the quiet. The silence is where He prepares you for what's next. It's where He equips you for the battles ahead. It's where he teaches you the lessons that will carry you through the rest of your life. So what do you do in the silence? You grow, you learn, you prepare, you trust, and above all, you hold on, because the silence will not last forever. The day will come when the quiet breaks, when the answers arrive, and when the purpose behind the silence becomes crystal clear. And when that day comes, you'll look back and realize that the silence wasn't a setback, it was a setup for something far greater than you could have imagined. Right now, you might feel like you're in a storm, you might feel like you're stuck in a valley, surrounded by darkness, with no way out. But I promise you, the silence is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a new chapter. It's the foundation of a testimony that will inspire others and bring glory to God. So don't give up, don't lose hope. Don't let the silence defeat you. Instead, let it strengthen you. Let it refine you. Let it prepare you for what's coming. Because what's coming is worth the wait. What's coming will make every moment of silence worthwhile. Hold on, my friend. The silence is your greatest growth lesson, and when you emerge from this season, you'll be stronger, wiser, and more prepared than ever before. The silence isn't the end, it's just the beginning. Have you ever been in a place where you desperately sought answers, but all you encountered was silence? The kind of silence that feels like a heavy weight pressing on your heart, leaving you to wonder if you've been left all alone? It's a moment that feels utterly confusing and at times overwhelming, yet this kind of silence is something every one of us will face in life, and how we understand it can change everything. Silence is one of the most misunderstood experiences. As human beings, we are wired to seek connection, affirmation, and immediate feedback. In relationships, we equate silence with disinterest or rejection. When someone doesn't respond to our words, we often assume the worst. This same mindset can carry over into our relationship with God. When we don't hear His voice in the way we expect, when we don't see immediate answers to our prayers, it's easy to jump to conclusions. God doesn't care. He's too busy. Maybe I've done something wrong. But what if that silence wasn't a sign of abandonment? What if God's silence wasn't a punishment, but a profound invitation to trust, grow, and prepare for what's ahead? To truly understand this, we must first challenge our assumptions about silence and learn to see it in a new light. Consider this: silence, though uncomfortable, is often a precursor to something extraordinary. Think about the moments in nature that we often overlook. Before the sun rises in all its glory, there is stillness. A quiet calm blankets the earth as if it's holding its breath in anticipation. Similarly, when a seed is planted in the ground, it disappears into the silence of the soil. There's no fanfare, no immediate visible change. But deep beneath the surface, in that quiet and unseen place, something remarkable is happening. Growth, roots are spreading, foundations are being laid, and in time life will burst forth. The same is true for us in our silent seasons. God's silence isn't a lack of activity, it's a period of hidden work. Just as a craftsman shapes his masterpiece away from prying eyes, God uses the silence to shape us in ways we cannot yet comprehend. It's not a time to despair, it's a time to trust. Now let's look at the role silence plays in other areas of life. In music, silence is just as important as the notes. A pause, a rest, creates rhythm and depth. It gives the listener space to reflect, anticipate, and connect with the melody. Without moments of silence, music would lose its impact. Similarly, in storytelling, silence often precedes a pivotal moment. It's the quiet before the revelation, the pause before the breakthrough. Silence builds tension, but it also sets the stage for transformation. But let's be honest, silence doesn't feel powerful in the moment. It feels frustrating, it feels lonely, it feels like rejection. Why? Because we are conditioned to equate activity with progress. If we can't see movement, we assume nothing is happening. If we don't hear a response, we think the conversation is over. And when it comes to our relationship with God, this mindset can lead us down a dangerous path of doubt. Here's where the truth challenges us. God's silence is never inactivity. It's never indifference. Instead, it's an intentional and loving pause that allows us to grow in ways we wouldn't otherwise. Imagine a teacher giving their student time to solve a problem on their own. The teacher isn't silent because they've abandoned the student. They're silent because they want the student to develop skills, resilience, and understanding. God's silence often works in the same way. Sometimes silence is God's way of redirecting us. When all doors seem closed and no answers come, it might be because the path we're on isn't the one meant for us. God's silence forces us to stop, reflect, and seek Him more earnestly. It's in these moments that we are reminded silence isn't a period at the end of a sentence. It's a comma, a pause that points us toward the next part of the story. Think back to some of the greatest breakthroughs in your own life. Were they born out of ease, comfort, and noise? Or did they come after a period of waiting, questioning, and even struggling in the silence? For most of us, it's the latter. It's those seasons of silence that teach us patience, resilience, and trust. They strip away our illusions of control and force us to lean into something greater. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine an artist working on a masterpiece. From a distance, the canvas looks empty, just a blank surface. The onlooker might wonder, why hasn't the artist started? Why is nothing happening? But up close, the artist is mixing colors, planning strokes, and envisioning the final creation. The silence of the canvas doesn't mean inactivity, it means preparation. And when the masterpiece is finally revealed, the onlooker realizes that every moment of silence was a vital part of the process. God's silence operates in the same way. When you feel like nothing is happening, He is working behind the scenes, mixing the colors of your life, planning every detail of the masterpiece He's creating in you. The silence isn't wasted, it's essential. Finally, consider this silence as an invitation to intimacy. When life is noisy, it's easy to miss the small, still voice of God. But in the silence, when everything else fades away, you're left with nothing but Him. And it's in that place of stillness that you discover who He truly is: a loving Father, a faithful provider, and a constant presence, even when you can't feel Him. So as we step into this journey of understanding God's silence, let's begin with this truth. Silence isn't the absence of God's work. It's the fullness of His preparation. It's not a sign of rejection. It's a reminder that something greater is coming. And while silence may be hard to embrace, it is in fact one of the most powerful tools for growth and transformation. Growth is often misunderstood. We like to think of it as loud, visible, and immediate, a moment when everything changes in an instant and we emerge victorious. But in reality, growth is rarely like that. It's often slow, unseen, and deeply personal. And more often than not, it happens in silence. Think about the most powerful transformations in nature. A seed, when planted, doesn't grow in the light. It starts its journey deep underground, buried in soil, far from the sun. There, in the darkness and silence, it begins to sprout. Its roots spread out, searching for water, creating a foundation that will support its future growth. Above ground, nothing seems to be happening, but beneath the surface, where no one can see, life is forming. This is the nature of growth that starts in the hidden, silent places. Growth in silence is also about trust. When you can't see the results, when you don't know what's coming next, you have to trust the process. This is especially true in our relationship with God. When we pray and don't hear an immediate answer, it can be tempting to think that God isn't listening. But the silence is often a sign that He's working in ways we can't yet see. It's an invitation to trust His timing and His plan, even when it doesn't align with our expectations. Let's take an example from Scripture, the story of Joseph. Joseph was given dreams of greatness as a young man, but before those dreams became reality, he endured years of silence. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. For years, it must have seemed like God was silent, but in that silence, God was shaping Joseph into the man he needed to be. When the time was right, Joseph emerged from the silence stronger, wiser, and ready to fulfill his purpose. The same pattern can be seen in the life of Moses. After fleeing Egypt, Moses spent 40 years in the desert, living in obscurity. It was a time of silence, a time of preparation. When God finally called him to lead the Israelites out of slavery, Moses was ready not because of what he had done during the noise of his youth, but because of what he had learned during the silence of the desert. Even Jesus experienced the power of silence. Before beginning his public ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness, fasting and praying. It was a time of testing and preparation, a time to align his will with the Father's. That silence was not a sign of weakness or inactivity. It was the foundation for everything that would follow. So what can we learn from these examples? First, that growth in silence is intentional. It's not a random pause or an oversight. It's a necessary step in the process. Second, that silence is not the absence of God's work, but the evidence of his careful planning. And third, that growth in silence prepares us for the challenges and opportunities ahead. When we embrace the silence, we open ourselves to transformation. We learn to let go of our need for control, to surrender our plans to God's greater wisdom, and to trust that he is working all things together for our good. The silence may not feel comfortable, but it is where we become who we are meant to be. In this season of silence, remember this: just because you can't see the growth doesn't mean it isn't happening. Just because you can't hear the answers doesn't mean they aren't coming. Trust the process. Embrace the stillness and know that the silence is not the end, it's the beginning of something extraordinary. The silence we often encounter in our spiritual journey isn't just about waiting for answers. It is also a crucial season for faith testing and refinement. The process of growth and development is not linear, nor is it always straightforward. Instead, it's in the silence that our faith is truly tested, stretched, and strengthened in ways that are impossible to achieve in moments of clarity and certainty. In the Bible, we see numerous stories of individuals whose faith was not just tested, but refined during periods of waiting that were marked by silence, struggle, and uncertainty. Take, for example, the story of Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but for years there was no sign of that promise being fulfilled. Abraham and his wife Sarah grew older and still no child came. In the silence of unanswered prayers, Abraham's faith was stretched beyond what he could have ever imagined. It was a testing ground for his trust in God's timing, and in the end, God's promise was fulfilled when Abraham was at the end of his strength, teaching us that faith in silence is the kind of faith that trusts even when the situation seems impossible. This period of waiting is essential because it helps us move from a shallow faith that seeks only immediate gratification to a deeper, more trusting relationship with God. In times of silence, God is not absent. He is actively refining our faith, purifying our hearts, and preparing us for the future he has in store. Faith, in many ways, is like a muscle. It has to be worked, tested, and stretched to grow. Without resistance, there is no strength. Without difficulty, there is no endurance. Just as physical muscles grow through tension and strain, our faith grows through the tension of waiting and the strain of silence. We learn to trust not in what we see, but in what we believe. Imagine you're a runner preparing for a marathon. The training isn't easy. You have to push yourself even when your body screams for you to stop. You train in silence when no one is watching, when there's no applause, and often when the finish line seems far out of sight. But that's where your endurance builds. That's where your strength develops. And eventually, when the race begins, all that unseen training pays off. The same is true for our spiritual lives. When we are tested in the silence, when we feel that God is distant, our faith grows deeper roots. And when the time comes for us to step into what He has prepared for us, we will be ready. Silence is also an opportunity for God to refine our character. In the quiet moments, we are confronted with our weaknesses, our impatience, our anxiety, our desire for control. In the noise of our busy lives, we often mask these insecurities with distractions. But in the silence, we can no longer hide. The things that we rely on for comfort and reassurance fade away, and we are left face to face with our vulnerability. It's in these moments of discomfort that God has the chance to shape us into who we are truly meant to be. Think about gold. Before it can be turned into a precious object, it must first undergo a refining process. The gold is heated in a furnace until it melts, and in the process, all impurities rise to the surface where they can be removed. The heat is necessary to purify the gold, just as the heat of silence purifies and refines our hearts. Without this refining process, the gold would remain impure, and our faith would remain shallow. It's the heat, the pressure, and yes, the silence that allows us to become more like Christ. Through these trials, our faith becomes more genuine, more resilient, and more reflective of the character of God. The silence can feel like a furnace. It's uncomfortable. It's painful. It seems endless. But when we emerge from it, we are stronger, more steadfast, and more focused. The process of waiting, trusting, and enduring in silence transforms us from people of shallow faith to people of deep conviction. It is a process of personal growth that makes us ready for the greater things God has in store for us. Take a moment to think about how you respond in seasons of silence. Do you become anxious, doubting that God is even listening? Or do you use the silence as an opportunity to deepen your trust? It is easy to have faith when everything is going well, when life is loud and answers come quickly. But real faith, the kind that changes lives, is forged in the quiet moments when you have no choice but to lean on God's promises and trust His timing. During these silent seasons, our faith is not only tested, but also strengthened, refined, and purified. God is removing the things in our hearts that are holding us back from fully trusting Him. He's teaching us to rely on Him more and on ourselves less. And through this process, we begin to develop a deeper, more intimate relationship with Him. Think about the Apostle Paul, who endured countless hardships and imprisonments. In one of his letters, he says, "I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances," Philippians 4:11. Paul's faith was not shallow. It was the result of many years of trials, silences, and tests. He had learned through every hardship and every moment of waiting to trust God's provision, timing, and purpose. His faith was refined in the furnace of silence, and he emerged as one of the greatest witnesses of God's power. So in those moments when you feel abandoned or forgotten, when it feels like God is silent and distant, remember that your faith is being refined. Like gold in the fire, here you are being purified and prepared for something far greater than you can imagine. Trust that the silence is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a deeper, stronger, and more powerful faith. Ultimately, God's silence is not a punishment or a sign of His absence. It is a test, a preparation, and a process through which our faith is refined, strengthened, purified. It is in these times that we are shaped into the people God has called us to be. And it is in these moments of silence that our faith becomes unshakable, rooted in a trust that transcends understanding. When we emerge from the silence, we do so with a faith that has been tested and proven true. One of the most profound truths about God's silence is that it doesn't equate to his absence. Often we mistake silence for a lack of action, but in reality, God's work is always ongoing, even when we can't hear him or see it. Silence doesn't mean that God is inactive or indifferent. It simply means that his ways of working are not always visible to us at the moment. In times of silence, we are called to trust that God is still moving behind the scenes, shaping our hearts and lives in ways we can't perceive. This requires a shift in perspective. Instead of seeing silence as a void, we must recognize it as a space where God is preparing something greater. We can look to biblical stories to understand this principle. One of the clearest examples is the story of Joseph. God gave Joseph dreams of greatness when he was a young boy. But before those dreams could be fulfilled, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused and imprisoned. For years, Joseph endured silence. During this time, he might have wondered, where is God? Why hasn't he come to rescue me? What is the purpose of all this pain and suffering? But unbeknownst to Joseph, in the silence, God was doing something powerful. He was refining Joseph's character, teaching him patience, humility, and wisdom. And when the time was right, God used Joseph in ways he never could have imagined. He became the second in command in Egypt, responsible for saving not only Egypt, but also his own family from famine. Throughout the years of silence, God's hand was at work in Joseph's life, shaping him for his future role. But Joseph had to wait, endure, and trust, even when he couldn't see or understand what God was doing. In the end, Joseph's story was a testimony of how God works in ways that are often invisible to us at the time. And while Joseph couldn't understand the purpose of his suffering in the moment, he was able to look back and recognize God's hand at work when everything came together. A similar example can be seen in the life of Job. Job was a man who experienced unimaginable loss. His wealth, his health, and his family were all taken away. Through it all, Job cried out to God for answers, but God's response was silence. Job didn't receive the explanations he expected, and yet through his suffering, Job came to realize something profound, that God's ways were beyond his understanding, but he was still good and faithful. God's silence in the midst of Job's pain was not a sign of abandonment. It was an invitation to trust him more deeply, even when answers weren't immediately available. In both of these examples, Joseph and Job had to learn to recognize God's work in the silence. For Joseph, it was a time of preparation for a future he couldn't have predicted. For Job, it was a time of deeper revelation of God's sovereignty and goodness. In each case, the silence wasn't an absence of God's presence. It was a space where God was working in ways beyond human understanding. This principle holds true in our lives as well. When we find ourselves in seasons of silence, it's easy to assume that God is absent or indifferent. We may think that if he truly cared, he would answer our prayers immediately. But we must remember that God's timeline doesn't always match our own, and his ways are often much more intricate than we realize. In the silence, God may be shaping us, preparing us for a future season, or orchestrating events in ways we can't yet comprehend. This is why we need to cultivate the ability to recognize God's work in the silence. It's about trusting that even when we don't hear his voice, he is still speaking. Even when we don't see any outward signs of progress, he is still moving. His silence is not his absence, but a divine invitation to trust in his unseen work. One of the most powerful ways we can learn to recognize God's work in the silence is by remembering his faithfulness in the past. When we look back on our lives, we can often see moments where God was at work in ways we didn't understand at the time. It might have been through a trial, a difficult relationship, or a season of waiting. At the time, it felt like God was distant or silent, but looking back, we can see how he used those moments to shape us, refine us, and bring us to a place of greater faith. One of the most challenging aspects of God's silence is that it often forces us into a position of surrender. Silence, especially in the midst of our struggles and pain, exposes the areas of our lives where we still try to control, manipulate, or hold on to our own plans. It reveals our lack of trust and our need for control. And yet, it is in these very moments that God is inviting us into a deeper level of surrender and faith. When we feel abandoned or unheard, when our prayers seem to go unanswered and our hopes feel dashed, it can be tempting to react with frustration, anger, or doubt. In these times, we might even question God's goodness or his ability to act on our behalf. But the silence, rather than being a form of abandonment, is a powerful invitation from God to let go of our need for control and to fully surrender to his will. Surrender in the context of silence is not passive resignation. It is not simply giving up or giving in. It is an active, intentional choice to release our own agendas and allow God to lead. The very act of surrender is a declaration of trust, a trust that God knows better than we do, that his plans are greater than ours, and that his timing is perfect. This principle is beautifully illustrated in the life of Jesus. Before his ministry began, he spent 40 days in the wilderness, fasting and praying. During this time, he experienced deep silence and isolation. There were no crowds, no miracles, no signs or wonders, just a quiet, solitary desert. Yet in that silence, Jesus surrendered his own will to the Father's. When faced with temptations, he responded not with his own power, but with complete submission to God's plan. It was a profound example of trusting God even in the silence and yielding to the Father's will over his own. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus again faced the agonizing silence of unanswered prayer. As he prayed, he asked God to take the cup of suffering away from him if it was his will. But then he surrendered, not my will, but yours be done, Luke 22:42. This moment of surrender was one of the most powerful and significant decisions in history. Even in the silence of not receiving the answer he hoped for, Jesus chose to surrender fully to God's will, trusting that God's was better and more necessary than his own desires. The same invitation to surrender comes to us in our own times of silence. Often, when God doesn't speak or act in the way we want, it is because he is calling us to a deeper trust. Our instinct is to hold on tight, to try to make things happen in our own strength, or to demand answers from God. But in the silence, God is asking us to let go, to release our need for control, and to trust in his divine wisdom and timing. This process of surrender can be incredibly difficult, especially when we feel lost, confused, or alone. It can feel like we're on the edge of a cliff with no clear path forward, no certainty about what will happen next. But it is in these moments of complete surrender that God does his most profound work. When we release our need to control the outcome, we open ourselves up to receiving what God has in store for us, even if it doesn't look like what we had imagined. Think about the story of Abraham, who was asked by God to sacrifice his son Isaac, the child he had waited for decades to have. God's command was not only a test of faith, but also an invitation for Abraham to surrender his most cherished hope and dream to God. Abraham didn't know the outcome. He didn't have all the answers. All he knew was that God had asked him to do something, and he chose to obey. In his surrender, Abraham demonstrated profound trust. And in the end, God provided a ram as a substitute for Isaac, showing that his plans are always greater than our understanding. Similarly, there are moments in our lives when God asks us to surrender something important, whether it's a relationship, a job, a dream, or even our own sense of security. In those times of silence, when it feels like God is not giving us the answers we want, He may be calling us to trust Him with that surrender. It's in that place of letting go that we discover the depth of God's provision and His faithfulness. Surrendering to God in the silence isn't always a one-time decision. It's a continual process. We must choose every day to let go of our control and trust in God's perfect plan. And when we surrender, we experience a freedom that comes from knowing that we don't have to carry the weight of our own plans or worries. We can rest in the assurance that God is in control and His ways are higher than ours. The silence also provides an opportunity for us to examine what we're holding on to too tightly. Often we don't realize how much we are trying to kind of control until we experience a period of waiting or silence. In these moments, God reveals the areas of our lives where we still lack trust or where we are holding on to things that He's asking us to release. It could be a fear, a worry, or a desire for security that keeps us from fully trusting God. The silence becomes a mirror, revealing where we need to surrender. As we practice surrender in the silence, we also begin to experience a deeper sense of peace. It's the peace that comes from knowing we don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to figure everything out. We can let go of our need to control, and we can rest in the knowledge that God's plan is good, His timing is perfect, and His ways are far better than anything we could have imagined for ourselves. Ultimately, the silence is an invitation to trust, to let go, and to surrender. In that place of surrender, we discover the true meaning of faith, not simply believing that God will give us what we want, but trusting that He will always give us what we need in His perfect way and timing. And as we surrender, we find peace that surpasses understanding, knowing that the silence is not the end of our journey, but the beginning of a deeper walk with Him. One of the most transformative aspects of God's silence is that it provides a unique opportunity for reflection and personal growth. In our busy lives, filled with distractions, responsibilities, and constant noise, we often neglect the inner work that needs to be done within our hearts and minds. The silence that God sometimes leads us into is not a punishment, but a sacred space to pause, reflect, and recalibrate our lives. It is in this space that we find clarity, healing, and growth. When life is loud, we are often focused outwardly, responding to external demands and seeking validation or direction from others. In contrast, silence compels us to turn inward, away from the clamor of the world, and to face our own thoughts, emotions, and spiritual state. This reflective silence allows us to examine our hearts, uncover hidden motives, and confront any areas of life that we may have ignored or neglected. One of the primary purposes of God's silence is to give us the time and space to reflect on our lives and make adjustments where necessary. This time of reflection isn't meant to overwhelm us or bring condemnation, but to offer us an invitation to grow. Just as a gardener spends time carefully tending to the soil, removing weeds, and nurturing plants, God uses silence to help us tend to our inner lives, removing the things that hinder our spiritual growth and nurturing the things that will bear fruit in the future. Take, for example, the experience of David, the psalmist, who often found himself in times of personal reflection, especially during moments of silence. In Psalm 139, David invites God to search his heart. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Psalm 139, 23, 24. David understood that reflection in the presence of God was not a passive exercise, but an intentional decision to allow God to expose areas of his heart that needed healing or correction. David's example reminds us that in times of silence, we are not left to reflect alone. God is present with us in the silence, gently guiding our reflections and showing us areas where we need to grow. It's often in the quiet moments of introspection that God brings to the surface deep-rooted issues we may not have been aware of: pride, fear, unforgiveness, or selfishness. These things, though uncomfortable to face, need to be dealt with in order for us to experience true spiritual growth. In the silence, we also become more aware of the things that we are placing our identity in. In our busy lives, we often define ourselves by our work, relationships, or accomplishments. But when everything goes quiet, we are forced to confront the question, who are we really, apart from all the noise and external validation? It's in these moments of quiet reflection that we can reorient our identity back to the truth of who God says we are. In the Gospels, we see that Jesus himself often withdrew to solitary places to reflect and pray. He took time away from the crowds and the busyness of his ministry to reconnect with the Father and reflect on his mission. If Jesus, the Son of God, took time to withdraw and reflect, then surely we too must recognize the importance of these quiet moments for our own personal growth. This reflective silence allows us to hear God's voice more clearly. In the hustle and bustle of life, God's whispers can easily be drowned out. But when we step into the silence, we create a space where his voice can be heard. It's often in the stillness that we receive insights, direction, and clarity about our lives, relationships, and the next steps in our journey. One of the key areas of personal growth during a season of silence is the development of spiritual disciplines. Silence calls us into practices like prayer, meditation, and reading scripture, which are vital for our growth. These spiritual disciplines, when cultivated in the quiet, deepen our relationship with God and strengthen our ability to discern his will. It's often in the silence that we learn to appreciate the small, everyday moments of grace and presence, which are easy to overlook when we are caught up in the noise of life. Moreover, the silence serves as a time for us to process our emotions, especially those that we have been avoiding. Many of us go through life without giving ourselves permission to grieve, to be vulnerable, or to process pain. The silence offers us an opportunity to face our wounds, fears, and anxieties. We may not always understand why certain things have happened to us, but in the silence we create space for God to heal, restore, and renew our hearts. Another profound benefit of embracing silence as a time for personal growth is the development of emotional resilience. In silence, we confront our deepest insecurities and doubts, but we also discover God's faithfulness and strength in the midst of our weaknesses. Over time, this allows us to build emotional resilience and the ability to endure through life's challenges. We come to understand that our growth isn't dependent on external circumstances, but on our ability to find peace, strength, and hope in God, even when the world around us is chaotic. Silence also teaches us the value of patience. In a world that demands immediate results, we are often tempted to rush through our spiritual journey, seeking quick answers and instant gratification. But God's silence invites us to slow down and trust that his timing is perfect. Personal growth requires time, and in silence we learn to embrace the process rather than demanding immediate outcomes. We begin to realize that growth is not always seen in the immediate, but it is cultivated over time in the stillness and quiet moments with God. In the silence, we also learn the art of waiting. Waiting is not passive, it is active surrender, where we choose to trust God with our future, knowing that he holds all things in his hands. The silence teaches us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is wait in hope, knowing that God is working behind the scenes, preparing us for what is to come.